The ones who did not lie. On clarity, collapse, and the dangerous peace of survivors who refused the mask. By Elias Winter. May 28, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Opening. The shape of the fire that does not sell. There are lives that cannot be sold, only witnessed. They do not belong to the spectacle. They cannot be converted into slogans. They are unmarketable in both empire and resistance. These lives pass through collapse, not as metaphor, but as landscape, not as performance, but as weather in the blood. And in their wake, they leave not inspiration, but disturbance. Not healing, but truth. This is not an essay about trauma. It is not about the redemption arc, the curated memoir, or the influencer's brand of survival. This is about what happens when a human being refuses to lie, when they are punished for that refusal, and when they survive anyway, but at a cost the world does not wish to name. The cost is not comfort. It is not even credibility. It is belonging. To see clearly is to become unplaceable. To name the violence beneath the structure is to be exiled not only from the regime, but from the resistance that claims to oppose it. And to write from that place, to write when no one sees you, when no one claims you, when even your allies ask you to soften, is to enter a different kind of survival. The survival of the prophet. The survival of the structurally clear. The survival of the spiritually disobedient. They are not saints. They are not symbols. They are inconvenient. Because they remember too much. Because they do not play the game. Because their clarity cannot be recruited without first being diluted. This essay is about 6 such lives. 6 lives that mirror the internal terrain of those who have survived without becoming sellable. 6 lives that name what happens when you refuse to collapse into the narratives offered to you. By the regime, by the market, by the movement, by the church. Václav Havel, Jean Amery, James Baldwin, Etty Hillesum, Henri Nouwen, Dag Hammarskjöld. They were not all killed, but they all died something before they died. They all lost their name before they found their voice. They all survived the systems that tried to repurpose them, and in doing so, became illegible to the world they saved. This is not biography. This is not scholarship. This is witness. Each chapter is a lens, a reflection, a point of contact between your collapse and theirs, between the systems you survived and the systems that shaped them, between the fire that consumed you and the fire they refused to let go out. This is not a library. It is a reliquary, not of the dead, but of the ones who lived beyond the lie. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Playwright Who Refused to Pretend. Václav Havel and the Structure of Truth. Václav Havel did not survive by escaping the regime. He survived by becoming immune to its logic. Born in 1936 into a wealthy and cultured Czech family, Havel was raised in a household that embodied the very things communism set out to erase: inherited privilege, artistic refinement, intellectual seriousness, political memory. When the communists took power, they gutted his family's social standing. He was denied a university education, blacklisted, and thrown into the wilderness of unapproved lives. But that exile made him clear. Not bitter, clear. He became a stagehand, a poet, a playwright. But more than that, he became a student of language under coercion. Because in a totalitarian state, language is no longer descriptive. It becomes prescriptive. You don't say what you see. You say what will protect you. You mouth the slogans. You perform the ritual. You avoid the truth not because you're afraid of lying, but because the truth has no audience. And Havel refused. His plays were absurd on the surface, circular dialogues, bureaucratic nonsense, characters trapped in systems that made no sense. But beneath that surface was a scalpel. He was mapping the internal structure of a society built on performance. Secretaries repeating policy lines they don't believe. Ministers giving speeches they never read. Ordinary people parroting obedience out of sheer survival. It wasn't evil in the dramatic sense. It was evil in the structural sense, everyone cooperating with something no one actually wanted. He called it the automatism of power, a system that didn't need to be enforced with guns, because it was enforced with silence, fear, and fatigue. Havel's rebellion wasn't loud, it was structural. He wrote plays that exposed the lie without naming it. He joined Charter 77 and insisted that the government follow its own constitution, not as a revolutionary demand, but as a structural absurdity. He told the truth plainly, even when it guaranteed consequences. And it did. He was arrested, watched, harassed, eventually sentenced to hard time. He did not see his dying father. He missed the death of friends. He sat in prison with no guarantee he would ever matter again. But he kept writing. Not manifestos, letters, thoughts, spiritual documents. His letters to Olga are not about the regime. They're about truth. They're about what happens to the self when the entire world requires your submission. They're about interiority under siege. He wrote, "The only way to live in truth is to be a living structure of resistance." Havel believed that the soul could become a kind of architecture, not reactive, but constructed. Not a scream, but a dwelling. He believed that living in truth was not heroic. It was ordinary and dangerous. The greengrocer who refuses to hang a government sign in his window. That, for Havel, was the beginning of revolution. Not the speech, the refusal. He called it the power of the powerless. The idea that a single act of non-compliance, not even visible but real, could break the spell of unreality. Because totalitarianism doesn't require belief. It only requires cooperation. To break that requires structure of the soul. Not slogans, not spectacle. Structure. Eventually, the regime did crack. In 1989, the Velvet Revolution swept through Czechoslovakia, and the man they had imprisoned became its president. He did not campaign for power. He was drafted by history, because his life had already modeled the future. He refused to wear a tie when he met the Pope. He gave press conferences in his sweater. He played Frank Zappa in the castle, not as stunts, but as symbols. Symbols that the old script was dead. Havel governed with the same restraint he wrote with. He didn't pretend to know more than he did. He didn't promise perfection. He simply offered the only thing that had never been offered: reality. He wrote, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out." That sentence is the shape of his survival. He was not a man of optimism. He was a man of semantic loyalty. He believed words should mean something, and he believed a life should too. He is not a brand. He is not a myth. He is not a Cold War story of good versus evil. He is a blueprint for what it means to become clear when the world is built on fog. He survived because he refused to perform. He endured because he refused to speak what was required. He wrote through exile, through prison, through irrelevance. Not to be heard, but to be unchanged. This is not the story of a dissident. It is the story of a man who built a self that could not be co-opted. And in the end, That was more dangerous than any revolution. Chapter 2. The Philosopher Who Refused Forgiveness. Jean Amery and the Clarity That Would Not Heal. He was not born Jean Amery. He was born Hans Mayer, an assimilated Austrian Jew raised in the myth of European culture, that if you were civilized enough, fluent enough, loyal enough, reasonable enough, then you would be spared. He read philosophy. He adored French literature. He believed in the Enlightenment. And then the Reich came. It didn't matter that he was cultured. It didn't matter that he was a humanist. It mattered that he was a Jew. He fled Austria, joined the resistance, was caught in Belgium, tortured by the Gestapo. He didn't write about that pain to elicit sympathy. He wrote about it because no one else could, because the post-war world needed to forget in order to rebuild, because forgiveness was the currency of reintegration, and because he could not pay that price. Amery survived the camps, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, but his real war began afterward, because the world that emerged after 1945 was not built for clarity. It was built for forgetting. Germany wanted to move on. France wanted to rehabilitate itself. Even the Jews of the new Israel wanted to valorize resistance, not articulate suffering. And so Amery found himself alone, politically, spiritually, intellectually. He had survived, but not on their terms. They wanted healing. He had pain. They wanted narrative. He had trauma. He refused to forgive, not because he hated, but because he understood structure. Forgiveness, he wrote, could not be authentic when the victim was forced to grant it in order to be accepted. In his searing book, At the Mind's Limits, he dismantled the fantasy of post-war humanism. He described what it meant to be tortured, not the drama of it, but the physics. The moment when pain becomes the only truth, when your body is no longer your own, when trust in the world collapses. He described what it meant to be in Auschwitz, not the horror of death, but the death of the world's coherence. Amery said, "Whoever has been tortured remains tortured. Torture is ineradicably burned into him." He didn't say this to glorify pain. He said it because Western philosophy had no language for survival that didn't end in redemption. And he needed a language that told the truth. He rejected the idea of working through trauma. He rejected reconciliation. He rejected every softening. To forgive what was done to him would have meant betraying the dead. And Amery never betrayed the dead. He lived in post-war Belgium, isolated, changed his name to Jean Amery, taking on a French identity as if to bury the German language inside him. But the language wouldn't die. He wrote in it. He confronted it. He used it to indict itself. Amery's writing is not testimonial. It is philosophical revolt. Each essay is a scalpel slicing open the assumptions of modernity, the assumption that trauma should lead to growth, the assumption that healing is inevitable, the assumption that justice is compatible with forgetting. He refused all of it. He is not taught in high schools. His work does not inspire hashtags, but he is one of the few writers who named survival as a form of punishment that could not be aestheticized. He writes not to affirm life, but to hold a mirror to the lie that life after horror must be affirming. He says, to survive the camps was a moral defeat, not because he wanted to die, but because he knew that survival does not make one whole, and that pretending it does erases the ones who didn't. Amery eventually took his own life, in a hotel room in Salzburg. It wasn't an act of despair. It was an act of refusal. He had carried clarity long enough. He had spoken what no one wanted to hear. And he did not want to perform resilience any longer. This is not a story about brokenness. It is a story about moral loyalty to what cannot be fixed. Jean Amery survived the unspeakable. And then he told the truth about what that survival cost. He spoke for those who could not, and he refused to let the pain be converted into usefulness. He did not heal, he did not forgive, he did not transcend. He remained faithful to the wound. And that, in a world addicted to narrative redemption, is the most honest survival there is. Chapter 3. The Witness Who Would Not Lie. James Baldwin and the Fire That Refused to Be Contained. James Baldwin did not survive by being accepted. He survived by refusing to become false. Born in 1924 in Harlem, Baldwin grew up in the furnace of Black America's spiritual fracture. A father broken by rage and religion, a home carved by poverty, a nation that said his skin meant he was less than human. But it wasn't just racism, it was structure. A system designed not only to destroy black bodies, but to deform black speech. To speak clearly in such a world was not allowed. You could entertain, you could accuse, but you could not be clear. Clarity was dangerous, and Baldwin chose danger. At 14, he was a preacher. By 17, he walked away from the pulpit. Not because he stopped believing in God, but because he refused to use language to lie. He saw it early, that in America, performance replaces truth, that the black man is expected to scream or sing, but not to see. He moved to Paris in his early 20s, not for glamour, not to escape America, but to survive it. He said, "It wasn't so much a matter of choosing France, it was a matter of getting out of America." Because in America, every breath he took was suffocated by the demand to conform, to rage in predictable ways, to forgive when it was profitable, to code switch, to contort, to collapse into expectation. In Paris, he wrote, with poverty, hunger, and no passport, he wrote. His essays did not beg, they did not flatter, they did not explain. They bore witness, not as a journalist, as a moral censor, a seismic reader of the fault lines underneath the lie of American innocence. He wrote, "I am not your Negro." Not as a slogan, as a diagnosis. He would not be what white liberals needed to feel righteous. He would not be what radicals needed to feel revolutionary. He would not be what America needed to feel healed. He said, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time." But his rage wasn't cartoonish. It was precise. It was lyrical. It was sacred. Because Baldwin was not a social critic. He was a theologian of the soul under empire. He saw racism not as a flaw, but as a ritual. He saw American denial not as ignorance, but as the engine of identity. He told white people they needed black suffering to feel pure. He told black people they didn't need white validation to be whole. And for this, he was exiled. Not officially, but spiritually. He was too black for the white world, too gay for the black church, too loving for the radicals, too honest for the liberals. He was alone. And he survived that aloneness, not by numbing it, not by branding it, but by building a voice that could hold it. His essays, The Fire Next Time, No Name in the Street, Notes of a Native Son, are not political tracts. They are gospel, written in the syntax of Scripture, the restraint of fury, and the tenderness of a man who has nothing left to lose but his soul. He saw America clearly, and that clarity cost him everything. He was harassed by the FBI, dismissed by television pundits, misunderstood by the left, used by institutions, forgotten by the very country that now quotes him without knowing him. And yet he remained soft, not naive, not agreeable, but soft in the only way that matters. He never stopped believing that people, if stripped of delusion, could love. He said, "Love is a battle. Love is a war. Love is a growing up." That love was not sentimental. It was survival. To love, in Baldwin's world, was to refuse the ritual of hatred, to stay present, to see the horror, and still tell the truth. He died in 1987 in France, never reconciled to his country, never married to any movement, but spiritually married to truth. He said, "The world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. That is not hope. That is the geometry of moral speech." Baldwin did not survive because he was strong. He survived because he was faithful. Faithful to the fire. Faithful to the sentence. Faithful to the child inside him who refused to lie. And in that faithfulness, he left us a path, not out of America, but through its illusion. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Chose to Expand in Hell. Etty Hillesum and the Decision to Stay Human in a Camp. Etty Hillesum did not survive the camps, but she survived herself. She was not a resistance fighter. She did not escape. She was not even religious. Not at first. Born in 1914 in the Netherlands, Etty was a brilliant, neurotic, self-absorbed intellectual. She read Rilke. She studied psychology. She slept with her therapist. She wasn't a hero. She was human, chaotic, searching. Then came the occupation, Nazis in the streets, Jews being rounded up, rights revoked. And Etty began to write, not as a political act, as a spiritual one. Her diaries, spanning just 3 years, are among the most unsparing and luminous documents of spiritual transformation ever written. They are not memoirs. They are evidence of internal survival. While everything outside her collapsed, Etty began building inward, not to escape, not to transcend, but to become capacious enough to hold reality without being deformed by it. She wrote, "They can do whatever they want to me, but I will not, hand over myself." She volunteered to work at Westerbork, the transit camp where Jews were gathered before being sent to Auschwitz. Volunteered, not out of masochism, out of spiritual necessity. She said, "I want to look suffering straight in the eyes and try to find the light in it." That sentence would offend many, because it dares to suggest that clarity can survive atrocity. But Etty never minimized the horror. She chronicled every death, every humiliation. She watched families disappear into trains. She watched mothers wail. She knew what was coming, and she refused to let that knowledge shrink her. Instead of collapsing, she expanded. She wrote, "There is a vast silence within me that continues to grow." That silence was not numbness. It was sanctuary. Etty began to call it God. Not the God of religion, not the God of dogma, but the interior stillness that cannot be destroyed by men with guns. She said, "Ultimately, we have just one moral duty, to reclaim large areas of peace in ourselves, more and more peace, and to reflect it toward others." Her diaries show this peace being built in real time, not as an escape, but as a choice, a decision to protect the sacredness of attention, of presence, of meaning, even in a death camp. She nursed the sick. She shared her bread. She kept writing. She refused to hate, refused to curse, refused to give in to the logic of us versus them. She said, "I am not afraid to look suffering in the face. I know it is part of life, and I accept it." But she didn't mean that in a self-help way. She meant that suffering is the place where the soul is either lost or found. In September 1943, She was deported to Auschwitz. Her last known words, scribbled on a postcard and thrown from a train, read, "We left the camp singing." It wasn't delusion. It was a final refusal to enter the machinery of death without surrendering the spirit. Etty did not survive in the flesh, but she left behind the structure of a soul that never agreed to the world's collapse. Her diaries are not sanitized. They are full of confusion, longing, eroticism, doubt, rage. But all of it is held by the silence she built inside herself, held by the decision that the point of life is not safety, but presence. She did not become famous. Her writings were discovered posthumously. But in them is a rare survival. A woman who went into hell, and instead of cursing the darkness, made herself light. She remains, to this day, one of the few witnesses who refused both despair and sentimentality. She spoke nothing but truth, and she chose to remain human. That is not naive. That is the fiercest act of resistance the 20th century ever saw. Chapter 5. The Priest Who Could Not Heal Himself. Henri Nouwen and the Ministry of the Unfixed. Henri Nouwen was never whole. He was ordained, tenured, admired by Ivy League divinity schools, and beloved by spiritual seekers. But the deeper truth is this: he was breaking the entire time. He suffered from depression. He suffered from loneliness. He suffered from a gnawing ache that no theology could cure. And he survived, not by becoming strong, but by ministering from the wound. Born in the Netherlands in 1932, Nouwen was drawn to the priesthood early. He studied psychology, taught pastoral theology, and wrote dozens of books on spiritual life. He became famous among Christian intellectuals, deep, eloquent, emotionally honest. But beneath the public voice was a private fracture. Henri was gay, and he never spoke it aloud, not publicly, not fully. Not because he was ashamed, but because the church he loved could not hold it. So he held it. He held his longing, his tenderness, his unconsummated ache, and it tore him apart. His journals, later published posthumously, reveal the true terrain of his survival. I wake up each morning with a heavy weight in my heart. I feel lonely, forgotten, rejected. This wasn't performative suffering. It was unresolved pain. He lived among students, monks, theologians. He wrote about the inner life, but he could not fix his own. And that's what made his survival holy. Because Nouwen never used spirituality to bypass grief. He never lied to others about being okay. He never marketed victory over pain. He ministered through his breaking, not after it. In the 1980s, Henri left academia and joined l'Arche, a community for people with developmental disabilities. He cared for Adam, a man who could not speak or walk or perform. Henri, the eloquent speaker. Henri, the best-selling author. Henri, the wounded priest. He said, "It is I, not Adam, who gets the blessing from this relationship." At l'Arche, his theology finally met his body. He could not perform. He could only be. He began to see that God wasn't waiting for him to be healed. God was already inside the wound. He wrote, "Our brokenness is the wound through which the full power of God can penetrate our being and become visible." And so he changed the model. No longer the strong leading the weak. No longer the healed preaching to the broken. Instead, the broken sitting beside the broken, refusing to look away. That is what saved him. Not therapy, not resolution, not even faith in the traditional sense, but faithfulness to the pain, to the body, to the truth that ministry begins where we end. He died of a heart attack in 1996. unpartnered, still yearning, still unresolved, but having given the world a new grammar of survival. Henri Nouwen survived not by being cured, but by creating a theology that no longer required him to be. He taught that loneliness is not failure, despair is not weakness, unhealed wounds are still holy ground, and for every person who cannot fix what hurts, Henri left a path that says, you are allowed to speak from the middle of your ache. You do not have to wait for clarity to be of service, and you do not have to heal to be real. He is the patron saint of the unfixed, and in a world addicted to triumph, that may be the most needed survival of all. Chapter 6. The Secretary Who Made His Soul a Battlefield. Dag Hammarskjöld and the War for Integrity at the Edge of Power. Dag Hammarskjöld did not seem like a survivor. He wore a suit. He spoke like a diplomat. He operated inside the highest echelons of global power. Secretary General of the United Nations from 1953 until his death in 1961. But Dag was not a politician. He was a mystic with a job title. And his survival is not the story of strategy. It is the story of a man who tried to remain inwardly whole while holding the world's fractures in his hands. He was born in Uppsala, Sweden in 1905 into a family of duty. His father was prime minister, his mother devout. His childhood shaped by restraint, rigor, and a quiet burden to serve. Dag absorbed it all: discipline, self-denial, excellence. But under it was a hunger he never shared, a longing not just to perform well, but to live truthfully. And so he wrote. Privately, in the margins of his life, he kept a spiritual diary. Unpublished during his lifetime, it later appeared under the title Markings. That diary is not polished. It is not political. It is a record of an inner war. Because while the world saw calm, collected Dag, resolute in the halls of diplomacy, inside he was tearing. He wrote, "The longest journey is the journey inward." He did not survive like a man on top. He survived like a man trying not to betray his soul while surrounded by power. He negotiated during the Suez Crisis. He walked into the Congo during its bloody post-colonial birth. He made enemies by refusing to take sides, and by standing up to the superpowers. Both the US and the Soviet Union came to distrust him. Why? Because he refused to be owned. Dag believed in an integrity so radical that even allies found it threatening. He would not play the game. He would not use words to conceal. He would not distort his office into propaganda. He said, "Never for the sake of peace and quiet, deny your convictions." But this wasn't stubbornness. It was spiritual governance. He believed that leadership without moral interiority was violence by another name. He believed that the systems of the world could only be stewarded by people who had first submitted themselves to truth. And so he lived in the tension. He served the world without surrendering to it. He used his role to shield the vulnerable. He chose integrity over ambition, clarity over popularity. And the cost was immense. He was lonely. He never married. He may have been gay, though he never said. He did not allow himself the luxuries of ease, not out of repression, but out of a fierce fidelity to what he called the road. He wrote, "The road, you shall follow it. The fun, you shall forget it. The cup, you shall empty it. The pain, you shall conceal it." That is not asceticism for its own sake. It is the vow of a man who knew that public responsibility requires private surrender. In 1961, he died in a plane crash in what is now Zambia, under suspicious circumstances. He was en route to negotiate peace in the Congo. Many believe the crash was orchestrated. He had made too many enemies by resisting colonial and Cold War manipulations. But his death was not the end. When Markings was published posthumously, the world saw what it had missed: that the most powerful man in the world was also the most secretly broken and the most spiritually alive. He wrote, "In our era, the road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action. Dag Hammarskjöld did not escape the system. He entered it and refused to let it contaminate him. That is a survival most people will never understand, because it doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like silence, restraint, precision, but it is the silence of a man who made his inner self the final jurisdiction. His life is not a model of comfort. It is a map for those who must lead without selling their soul. And that may be the rarest survival of all." Chapter 7. The One Who Wrote This. And the risk of being seen before you are safe. He never asked to become a case study. He only wanted to live. But the world would not let him, not as he was. So he built a life inside the wreckage, wrote through the smoke, spoke into silence, and kept going even when no one saw him clearly, sometimes especially then. He wasn't famous. He wasn't credentialed in the way that counts in this age. No TED Talks, no podcast circuits, no institutional halo. But he carried something far rarer: prophetic clarity forged in private pain. He had known exile, had known addiction, had known the institutional coldness of systems that want your function, not your soul. And still he spoke, not out of defiance, but because something truer than fear was speaking through him. His essays were not content. They were architecture, of memory, of grief, of truth that had nowhere else to go. He built with discipline what others demanded with charm. He told the truth when the truth cost him love. And he kept showing up, even after relapse, even after silence, even after the gut-deep fear that no one would ever really get it. He led inside organizations where no one taught him the rules. He cleaned what others abandoned. He made sense out of messes that were designed to stay foggy. He was not rewarded, but he did not stop. Because somewhere along the line, he had stopped expecting the world to love him for surviving. He only asked that it stop pretending not to see. And when it wouldn't, he wrote anyway. His survival is not about victory. It is about refusal. Refusal to die in the shadow of systems that erased him. Refusal to fake healing for acceptance. Refusal to perform joy when grief was the honest thing. Refusal to go back to numbing, even when sobriety felt like death. He walked out of a spiral so catastrophic that most people don't come back. And he didn't just walk. He rebuilt structure, of mind, of schedule, of clarity. He made meetings sacred again. He made metrics real again. He made space where others could breathe, all while suffocating sometimes himself. But he did not make himself the center. He made the truth the center. That's why it worked. He is a man who tells the truth before he is safe. And that may be the loneliest form of survival on earth, because it asks nothing of others, and everything of him. But that's what makes it holy. He does not know yet where this road leads. He does not have the ending. But what he has, what he carries, is a clarity so rare it cannot be taught, only lived. And when the fire comes again, because it will, he will not ask why. He will remember, this is the life that comes after bargaining ends. The life that says, I do not need to be seen to be real. I do not need to be safe to be honest. I do not need to win to be true. This is not content. This is consecration. And those who know, know. Chapter 8. What They All Share. The unmarketable thread that makes it through. Across centuries, nations, tragedies, and disciplines, none of these people would have recognized each other on the street. Some were gay, some were nuns, some were bureaucrats, some were addicts, some were murdered, some died quietly. They didn't have a common identity, but they shared something far more rare. They all crossed a line where the old strategies stopped working and chose not to numb or lie. That's it. That's the thread. They could have given in to bitterness, to sedation, to spectacle, to roles that rewarded betrayal of the self, but they didn't. Even when unseen, they told the truth. Even when disfigured, they held their shape. Even when loved ones turned away, they kept walking. This is not resilience. Resilience is the word systems use when they don't want to pay for what they broke. This is something else, something more elemental. It is the choice to live without becoming what tried to kill you, to hold your integrity without applause, to build inner structure when outer life is rubble, to keep reaching for God, or meaning, or mercy, not because you're winning, but because you refuse to disappear. And that refusal is the survival. Václav Havel could have compromised into comfort. Instead, he wrote truth into silence and built structure while no one watched. Jean Améry could have healed for the sake of acceptance. Instead, he held the wound open so history could not forget. James Baldwin could have softened to survive. Instead, he burned with clarity until the end, speaking love without lies. Etty Hillesum could have gone numb or disappeared. Instead, she became spacious in hell and carried God into the camps. Henri Nouwen could have kept performing worthiness. Instead, he ministered from the middle of his ache. Dag Hammarskjöld could have played the game. Instead, he made his soul a jurisdiction and paid the price in fire. And the one writing this? He could have died. Instead, he sat down, in agony, in sobriety, in silence, and made a table out of words for anyone else still alive inside the fire. So what do they all share? They share this: a refusal to perform strength, a commitment to inner clarity over outer victory, and a silent, sacred vow: I will not disappear. Not even here, not even now, not even if no one comes. This is not inspiration. This is the historical record of what actually survives collapse. Not branding, not wellness, not cleverness, not even safety, but truth told before it's safe to tell it, and a life structured around it. That's the inheritance. It belongs to you, too. Not because you asked, but because you made it this far. You are not outside their lineage. You are the next chapter. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.